Hey guys, and welcome back to Mike and his whiteboard. My name is Mike, this is my whiteboard, and in this segment we construct concepts for you visually. So today we're going to talk about intrinsic value. The very first whiteboard we discussed call value, and we drew visually the extrinsic and intrinsic value and how that would look visually here. So if you want to check out that segment, definitely go into the show archives at the top of the page, and you can view the slides if you'd like. You can even download them yourself. So any slides that we present here, you can download for yourself. So without further ado, let's get into intrinsic value. So you see right here, we've got premium and how it's broken up with intrinsic and extrinsic value. So before we get into intrinsic value, let's just quickly discuss premium. So option premium is essentially what you pay for the option if you're buying it, or what you receive if you're selling it. So you can always calculate intrinsic value. Extrinsic value is made up of a few different factors, but we'll get into that tomorrow when we take a deep dive into extrinsic value. But just pretty much all you need to know is that intrinsic value and extrinsic value make up option premium. So for this graph, we're going to look at specifically in the money options. And what that means, it's going to mean different things for calls than it means for puts. So for calls, in the money would mean if the strike price is below the stock price as you see here. And we can quickly discuss why that is. So a call option gives you the right to buy 100 shares of stock at a certain level for a certain amount of time. So if I'm looking at a 90 strike call, that gives me the right to buy 100 shares of stock at 90, even if the stock's trading at 100 right now. So the blue bar here is going to signify intrinsic value, and the red you see is going to signify extrinsic value. So one thing to note is that when you're looking at in the money options, the option premium is always going to be more than the intrinsic value of the option. So you can see here, if I've got a 90 call and the stock price is trading at 100, I have 10 points of intrinsic value. That can always be calculated, but you'll see when you're looking to trade it, it's going to be trading for more than $10. And that's because you have different aspects of extrinsic value that give it an extra buffer of premium. So that's going to be time and volatility value. But again, we'll get into that tomorrow when we take that deep dive into extrinsic value. So we've got this example here that's 10 points in the money. You can clearly see that we've got 10 points of intrinsic value and a little bit of extrinsic value. Now, what happens if we're looking at a deeper in the money call? So when we throw this on, you can see when we throw on the 80 call, so now we're 20 points in the money, we have the right to buy 100 shares of stock at the price of 80, even though the stock price is trading at 100. But what you'll notice is that the extrinsic value bar all the way to the right there is much smaller than the strike price of 90. And that's because the deeper in the money you go, the more that option is going to trade like stock, because it's going to have a higher delta. So we discussed this briefly in the first whiteboard episode when we were talking about call value and how it's made up. But it's very important to know that the closer you get to at the money, that's going to be the highest extrinsic value. But the deeper in the money you go, regardless of whether it's calls or puts, it's going to cascade lower, and the deeper and deeper you go, the more and more it's going to trade like stock, and you'll see very little extrinsic value. So quickly reviewing, we've got calls here. Calls are in the money when they're below the stock price, or when you have strikes that are below the stock price, because it gives you the right to buy the shares at a cheaper price. If we look at puts, on the other hand, puts are going to be in the money when the strike price is above the stock price. And that's simply because a put gives you the right to sell 100 shares of stock at a certain price. So if I have the right to sell 100 shares at 110 when the stock price is currently trading at 100, that's going to have 10 points of intrinsic value. Again, we've got the same red bar here, so even though we've got 10 points of intrinsic value, the option premium is going to be more than that 10 points. Because if you're buying that option to hold those shares, you have to pay extra premium to have that right. So again, just like the calls, we've got the in the money puts with extrinsic value and intrinsic value. And the deeper we go, if we throw on the next bar here, if we go into the 120 strike range, you'll see that now we're 20 points in the money. So again, this gives me the right to sell shares at 120, even though they're trading at 100. So I've got 20 points of intrinsic value, but I've got much less extrinsic value because, again, we're going deeper in the money. So the more it trades like long stock or short stock for puts, long stock for calls, the less extrinsic value there's going to be. So if we go to the next slide here, we're going to discuss basically the takeaways for intrinsic value in general. So the first one I'd like to review is premium equals intrinsic plus extrinsic value. Again, there's plenty of factors that go into the actual pricing of the premium, like stock price and time left until expiration, volatility, etc. But simply put, premium is always going to equal intrinsic plus extrinsic value. What's cool about that point is if you know the price of the option and you know the intrinsic value of it, you can subtract the intrinsic value to find the extrinsic value. So you can take this formula and swap it around to figure out whatever you're missing. The next point I'd like to point out is in the money options have intrinsic and extrinsic value. So in the money options, again, will have intrinsic value because they're in the money. They have intrinsic value. But as we showed on the original whiteboard, the very first one, extrinsic value pretty much looks like a bell curve. So even if an option is in the money, it's still going to have extrinsic value. But again, the further we go in the money, the lower extrinsic value there will be. The third takeaway here is out of the money options have only extrinsic value. So with out of the money options, there's no intrinsic value because temporarily it's going to be worthless. If I'm looking at out of the money options for calls, if in the money is below the stock price, out of the money is going to be above the stock price. And that's because if I have the right to buy shares at a higher price, even though the market price is at a lower level, so in our same example, if the stock price is trading at 100 and I can buy shares at 110, there's no real value. I don't have a reason to exercise that. So that's going to be considered out of the money. If options are in the money, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily profitable. So again, in the money, we get this request a lot in support. Some people say, well, this is in the money, so it must mean I'm profitable. Yes, if you're buying the option or buying the spread and it's in the money, then sure, it should show profit. But if you're selling the option or selling the spread, then that would mean the opposite. Because if you sold something and now it went in the money, it's going to have a higher value. So when you sell something, you need to buy it back to close a position. So if you sell something for X, but then you buy it back for 2X, you're now at a loss of 1X. So calls have intrinsic value if the strike price is below the stock price. Again, that's just simply because it gives you the right to buy 100 shares. So when they're in the money or have intrinsic value, it must be below the stock price because that's where you want to be, or that's where you want to buy the shares for a discount. At expiration, that's where the option will actually have value or intrinsic value. Puts, on the other hand, will have intrinsic value when they're above the stock price. So if I have the right to sell 100 shares higher than the stock price, at expiration, that will be exercised for the intrinsic value. And last but not least, in the money options will always be trading for more than their intrinsic value. And again, that's because there's no arbitrage here. I'm not going to be able to buy an option for $9 if the option is $10 in the money. If I could do that, I would do that all day and I'd make $1 at expiration. So it's never going to happen. You're never going to see that, which is why you're always going to see that extrinsic value buffer. So the premium is always going to be more than the extrinsic value. It's actually going to be intrinsic value plus extrinsic value. So this has been intrinsic value. Tomorrow, again, we're going to discuss extrinsic value, so we'll take a deep dive in that. We'll break it down in a few different ways that I'm sure not a lot of you have seen before. So if you have any feedback at all, shoot it over to support@, or you can tweet us at @DoTrading, @Tasty. Until tomorrow, where we discuss extrinsic value, I'm Mike. Have a great night.
Hey everyone, hope you liked this video. Click below to watch more videos, subscribe to our channel, or go to tastytrade.com to watch us live.